I'm so excited to introduce you to Ken Ludwig. If you are not familiar with him yet, you are about to fall in love with him, just like I did when I first met him. He is the Tony and Olivier award-winning playwright. He's written 28 plays and musicals. 6 of them have been on Broadway. 7 have been in London's West End. His work has been performed in over 30 countries in over 20 languages. He's been named among the top 12 most produced playwrights by American Theater Magazine for the last 5 seasons. And his best works include Lend Me a Tenor and Crazy for You. Either of those ring a bell. Those each ran for 5 years on Broadway and won the Tony and Olivier Awards for Best Musical. His Broadway plays have starred Alec Baldwin, Carol Burnett, Lynn Redgrave, Joan Collins, so fun, right? And his latest book, which you can kind of see over my shoulder here, How to Teach Your Children Shakespeare, is one of my absolute favorites. Yours might have a red cover. And it's actually won the Falstaff Award for Best Shakespeare Book of the Year. He's received numerous awards, including the Edgar Award for Best Mystery of the Year and the Edwin Forrest Award for services to the American theater. And this is really fun. His plays are performed somewhere in the United States every night of the year, except probably not during a pandemic, but every other time. We are delighted to have you back. You have been at Read-Aloud Revival to talk about Twelfth Night, Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, and then Pride and Prejudice, which was that time with you is really what turned me into someone who loves Jane Austen. So I am grateful that you're back.
It's so good to see you again. It's just terrific. Love being here.
Well, why don't we start by thinking about what we should know about Jane Austen herself before we dive deeper into Emma?
Sure. I took some notes of just a few biographical facts that I thought would be useful diving in. We often always go, okay, Shakespeare, but we don't really know the time periods, or Keats or Shelley. So Jane Austen, she was born in 1775. Easy to remember. It's the beginning of the year of the American Revolution. A big explosion at Concord, Lexington, and when Jane Austen was born. And she lived in a small village in England, and she died in 1817 at the early age of 41. She wrote 6 novels, and they fall into sort of 2 groups. There's the 3 earlier ones that she started when she was about 20 years old. And those are Northanger Abbey and Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. They never got published. She lives on, and it's not until the last 5 years of her life that she starts getting published, and she rewrites those books. Probably Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice started as epistolary novels, all in letters, and then she rewrote them. So Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice get published, and then she's encouraged, and she writes the 3 last ones, Mansfield Park, Emma, and Persuasion. None of these got published until 1811, when she was 36 years old and only had those last 5 years to live. She had 6 brothers. She had 2 of them became admirals. She had famously her sister Cassandra, who she adored, and it's to Cassandra that she wrote all those letters that still survive. Many don't, but a lot do. And she lived her adult life in what we call the Regency period of England, which is during that time the Romantics are starting to emerge, the early work of Keats and Byron, but her style really harks back to the earlier period, the Georgian era, and she's known for her manners and her poise and her classicism and her wit. Let me say 2 last things about her from a biographical standpoint. One is that while she didn't really have a formal education, she and Cassandra were sent off to little youngster schools when they were little that didn't kind of work out. But her parents were very well educated, and they had a terrific large family library full of books that Austen read, and virtually all of them, in my estimation. She's just so well read. And I think that's really crucial to say in the setting we're in now, because what the way she acquired her wealth of knowledge was simply by reading, as all writers do. Clearly, she knew from later works, we can see she knew her Shakespeare, her Henry Fielding, her Oliver Goldsmith, her Dr. Johnson. She knew them backwards and forwards. She also knew the sensational novels of the time, the popular novels, the Gothics, the thrillers, the romances, and she loved them like all young women did at the time, and all young men if they had a brain. And she's influenced by the Gothic novels, and you'll see that as we talk especially about Northanger Abbey in a minute. Secondly, like most great writers, there was no history in her family of writers. Parents weren't writers, no uncles or aunts, even though they were quite well educated. And the point is that, as all great people do, she invented herself, and out of nowhere became perhaps the greatest writer of prose fiction in the English language. How, we don't know. That's the great mystery. So I thought, Sarah, we should turn it over to you, and we could maybe approach getting to know Jane Austen through the opening lines of some of her novels.
Yes. So one thing that you said just stuck out at me too. So she wrote all of her novels in a pretty short period of time, it sounds like, then?
She wrote started the first three in a very short period of time. And then when her father retired they grew up in a little village of Steventon, and he wanted to move to Bath, she got pretty discouraged, didn't like Bath, and she didn't write that we know of, it's in none of the diaries, none of the letters, for a period of 10, 15 years. She probably did. She was probably thinking, she was probably sketching, because then when she had her later outburst of creativity in those last 5, 6 years, all 6 novels came out in their final versions.
Wow, that's astounding. I did not know that about her. So yes, okay, so Pride and Prejudice, which is, like I said, when you first came to Read-Aloud Revival, I had not really read Jane Austen. I had tried earlier when I was younger, and I just couldn't really get into it. You're introducing me to Pride and Prejudice really helped me fall in love with it. So I have become, of course, an Austenite, like all civilized women should be, I'm sure.
Good.
So these are the first lines of Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth, universally acknowledged, that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been there, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear, you must know, Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and 4 to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week."
Great. And you can hear all that irony dripping out of her when she says, well, if they're rich and they come, clearly they're the property of one of the daughters in the neighborhood, because the mothers are going to go after after this guy, which has a lot to do with her themes about marriage. Let me read a little bit of the opening of Northanger Abbey. And what's cool about this is, talk about irony. And this is great because it may be, I think, I've never read anybody say this before, but I think it may be the first lines she ever wrote in a mature novel. She wrote a lot of juvenile fiction when she was younger. This is Northanger Abbey. It's so great because it's so ironic, because this was her first novel when she is surrounded by all these Gothic pieces of fiction, pieces of Gothic fiction. They're all about their melodramas, about poor innocent girls who've led a horrible life and they've been poor and their parents have died and they've scrounged and oh my God, over the hill comes some horrendous villain who kidnaps them and keeps them in a cave, and then finally a hero appears and they get married. This was the kind of popular fiction that existed at the time, you know, a little like all our romances and thrillers that we still love today. So here's how she starts Northanger Abbey. She starts by talking about the heroine Catherine Morland, and she talks about the fact that Catherine Morland was clearly never was not born to be a heroine. She just didn't have any of these romantic characteristics, yet she's going to be the heroine of my novel. So here's how she starts. No one who had ever seen Catherine Morland in her infancy would have supposed her born to be a heroine. Her situation in life, the character of her father and mother, her own person and disposition were all equally against her. Her father was a clergyman without being neglected or poor, and a very respectable man, and he was not in the least addicted to locking up his daughters. Her mother was a woman of useful plain sense with a good temper, and instead of dying in bringing the latter into the world as anybody might expect, she still lived on, lived to have 6 children more and to see them growing up around her and enjoy excellent health herself. What a great way to open a comic novel. It's extraordinary and it's genius.
You know, I'm noticing just between those two, even how much we know about the characters in the first couple of sentences of the novel.
Yeah. Exactly right. And as we move into Emma, the first sentence almost says it all.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to read this one.
Okay.
Here's the first 3 paragraphs. We'll do the first 3 paragraphs. Is that good?
Great.
Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. She was the youngest of the 2 daughters of a most affectionate, indulgent father, and had, in consequence of her sister's marriage, been mistress of his house from a very early period. Her mother had died too long ago for her to have more than an indistinct remembrance of her caresses, and her place had been supplied by an excellent woman as governess, who had fallen little short of a mother in affection. 16 years had Miss Taylor in Mr. Woodhouse's family, less as a governess than as a friend, very fond of both daughters, but particularly of Emma. Between them, it was more the intimacy of sisters. Even before Miss Taylor had ceased to hold the nominal office of governess, the mildness of her temper had hardly allowed her to impose any restraint, and the shadow of authority being now long passed away, they had been living together, as friend and friend very mutually attached, and Emma doing just what she liked, highly esteeming Miss Taylor's judgment, but directed chiefly by her own.
It does tell us everything, doesn't it?
It does.
She does what she wants. She loves Miss Taylor, but she does what she wants. She's a spoiled rich kid.
Yeah.
And she said at one point, she says, I'm writing a novel. This is one of her letters to Cassandra, I think. She says, I'm writing a novel about a heroine that nobody is going to like but myself.
Which is interesting because I told you this, Ken.
Yeah.
When I first watched Emma, just not that long ago with my daughters, we watched the BBC version and we're about halfway in and I thought, I don't like her. I don't like Emma. And then we get to the second half and I'm watching and I'm realizing I am Emma. Just that vain, self-centered, maybe overly confident characteristics of her were the ones that I was thinking, oh, tisk, and then I realized it's because I was looking in a mirror.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
So of course now I love her because she can't help herself.
Good. And that's true. She can't. But she redeems herself in every single way in the course of the novel.
Yes.
We love her so deeply at the end. By the end.
Okay, so you're talking about these first lines and even just focusing, because I think sometimes, Emma's a long novel. So even just slowing down a little bit to savor those opening lines is showing me that there's so much to savor and relish. It reminds me a little bit of how, well, in your book, in the How to Teach Your Children Shakespeare book, the one that I had right behind me, that's sort of the key, I think, that you show us to enjoying Shakespeare with your kids is taking a few lines and memorizing them and savoring them and enjoying them in that very focused, delightful way. Is this a similar idea here?
Yeah, it is. It is very similar. Thanks for that. Um, One of the ways to get into the Jane Austen and get that feel for her is to memorize literally the first sentence. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man, it must be in want of a wife, is a way to always have a little anchor to her, and do it for Emma and do it for Northanger Abbey. The Sense and Sensibility is nice. It's very matter of fact, and the other two are Persuasion has a tricky opening that's very clever because it's her final, it's her autumnal novel that's very rich and deep and a bit melancholy, has its own way of opening. But to memorize a little bit and have it at your fingertips is a wonderful way to get to know an author, and that's why I do it in How to Teach Your Children Shakespeare. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, when I can even just comparing these three, I can see the difference in tone between the three.
Right.
Very subtle, but they all sound like Jane Austen to me now.
They do.
Yeah.
You sure planted her flag. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe what we could do is give a little summary of the story of Emma before we dive more into that one in particular, since we'll be talking about that one in particular today.
Great. And one of the things we'll be doing, Sarah and I talked in advance about this and thought it would be fun to talk about adaptations and how a single work like Emma is adapted in lots of different ways. So I wrote a short summary here to sort of anchor us exactly in what the story is, so we all know the basic story. Okay. It was written in 1815, and it's about a young woman named Emma Woodhouse who lives with her father in a small English village. And as Sarah just read, she is handsome, clever, and rich. And Austen tells us about a couple of paragraphs after where you stopped is that here's a quote: "The real evils of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much her own way and a disposition to think a little too well of herself." So Austen tells us that right on the first page. Okay, when the novel opens, Emma's best friend and governess of many years, which you heard, named Miss Taylor, is getting married to a Mr. Weston. He's a fine man, he's a neighbor, and we all love him. And this is a moment of really great change in the world of the Woodhouse family. It upsets Emma's father, who's a hypochondriac. He's hilarious in virtually all the versions, and especially in the novel, because he fears any change in his life. And the idea that Miss Taylor, the governess who's lived with them for all these years since his wife died, is going to leave is terrible. And meanwhile, Emma herself is worried about living alone in the house with her father and how deeply bored she's going to be, but in a gentle, sweet way. She obviously loves her father. And this is a good place for me to add about how important it is in a play or a novel to open at a moment of great change. One of my favorite books about Shakespeare is called Shakespeare's Game by the playwright William Gibson. And he points out how every Shakespeare play opens at a moment of great upheaval, and he calls it the happening. And here's what he says. This is a quote from his book. He says, "A play begins when a world in some state of equipoise, always uneasy, is broken into by a happening. Since it is not equipoise that we have paid to see, but the loosing and binding of an evening's disorder, the sooner the happening, the better. The plays open fast." And it's true of so much in literature. We don't need to sit around and have a scene painted for us that we kind of yawn. A certain Hardy does that a lot, and I always yawn and think, get the story started already. But Austen knows just what to do. She starts in the first paragraph. Miss Taylor is getting married. So back to the novel. Miss Taylor moves out, goes to live with her husband, and Emma needs to keep herself busy. So she befriends a girl who goes to a local boarding school. It's an orphan named Harriet Smith. And as the two become friends, Emma decides that she's going to find Harriet a husband. And that really is the backbone of the whole novel in a way that really helps us carry the story all the way through. First, she tries Mr. Elton, who is the local curate, who is pompous, a self-absorbed nitwit, very much like Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice.
Yes.
He's a nitwit in a slightly different way, but let me add that Jane Austen's father was a clergyman, so how that
Oh, that's interesting. Right.
Isn't it? So when she tries to set Harriet up, she tries to set him up with Mr. Elton. That backfires because Elton really wants Emma. Then she tries to set her up with Frank Churchill, a mysterious sort of figure who's Mr. Weston's daughter. But he turns out to be already engaged. And all of this is being looked at all the while by their wonderful, wonderful Mr. Knightley, their neighbor, Mr. Knightley, who is 16 years older than Emma and has always been sort of an older brother to her in a way, and can criticize her and just knows the family. He's just as if he's a member of the family.
Yeah.
And at the end of the novel, Emma realizes that she's in love with Mr. Knightley and always has been, and the novel ends in their marriage. And that's the summary, and it's a comedy of manners, and it's about youth, and it's about the blindness of youth and how things can go very wrong and can also then come right. That's, I think, what the novel's about. In some ways, it's also, of course, touches on a theme throughout Jane Austen, which was a very feminist theme, and one she really took on squarely in novel after novel. And that is that women in those days had very few choices about what they could do and how to make their way in the world. And if they didn't marry and marry rather well, they could face a life of penury. They could. How do you make a living as a woman in those days when all the doors are closed to you? And actually, Jane faced it herself. And as she never married. I should have added. Neither did her sister Cassandra, and they lived together with their mother. And the issue of money was a big one. But one of her brothers had been adopted into a wealthy family and was able to pay for them till Jane's very end. So that's another theme in the novel.
Interesting. I didn't realize that. I will say, so there are, as I'm listening to you summarize it, I'm thinking through how you mentioned there's a Mr. Elton in Emma, and then very similar to the Mr. Collins character in Pride and Prejudice. And I'm wondering what other, that would be fun to kind of dig through and see what other sort of similar character threads she weaves through all of her stories, or things that show up again and again in her stories.
Yeah, it would be fun. And they're all set in pretty much the same milieu of that gentry, the genteel society, which she was a part of, but often has somebody coming in from the outside, and their issue of being wealthy is a big issue. And they're innately, and the stories are all similar in another aspect, which is that they're innately comic. A comedy isn't just about making us laugh. Comedy is creating an atmosphere where laughter is part of the environment. So she creates a comic environment, as all great comic authors do, and that's true of all the novels.
Do you think that's done largely through, maybe not largely, but just partly through exaggeration? Because I'm thinking of how, like, Mr. Woodhouse is not just worried about everyone being safe. He's extremely worried about everyone being safe all the time, like hypochondriac kind of worried, you know?
Yeah. I think it does. I think that's one of the many tools in the toolbox of a comic writer. I think the tools include just certain tropes that we see again and again, servants who figure out problems, people who go to the country, marriage, romance, mistaken identities. Look, there's two really interesting tricks in Emma, which we tend to forget. She really pulls the wool over our eyes in some ways. Mr. Elton, it all looks to the world like Mr. Elton is in love with Harriet because, he wants her picture painted by Emma.
Yeah.
it's because all he wants to do is be around Emma while she's painting the picture. So it's all about Emma, not Harriet, but it looks like it's about Harriet. And she does it later. She has another trick in Emma where Harriet talks about being in love with the person who saved her. Well, Frank Churchill saved her from some gypsies, but it was Mr. Knightley who saved her on the dance floor when she was left alone and no one would ask her to dance. And she's thinking about Mr. Knightley. And that's the trick that Austen uses for the end of the novel, because when suddenly she thinks Harriet has her sights on Mr. Knightley, she looks at herself in the mirror and goes, oh my God, she can't do that. I'm in love with him.
Yeah. It takes that for her to even realize it, right?
Right.
Okay, so this brings up an interesting idea about adaptations, because I know, so we've been talking, or in our guide, and if anybody here did not get their Emma guide, we will send it out with the replay. We will send out this guide as well. It has a list of several different adaptations of Emma, including, let's see, we've got the original, or no, the BBC, I'm trying to put them in order, but okay.
The BBC.
Okay. Yes, the BBC, which is it's 4 hours, and it's episode.
Television. It's a television
series. Yeah,
it's fantastic. It's very true to the novel. Then we talked about maybe the Gwyneth Paltrow movie.
Yes, and then of course there's the brand new movie that just released.
Right. And then there's an audio book version that Emma Thompson does. She doesn't just read it. It's really clever and it's wonderful. There's a script written by a writer because scenes are played out, and not verbatim from the novel either, but scenes are played out just as much as we hear the prose of Austen read by Emma Thompson, and it's pretty great.
Yeah, I will say that was my favorite. So at this point, I've watched the BBC version and the new version and listened to that Emma Thompson audiobook. Like, it's a dramatization, basically an audio drama.
Right.
And that was my favorite. I loved that audio drama so much. And I actually thought, and this is interesting because I noticed in the questions that were sent in, Heidi mentioned this. She said she was struck by how much less conniving Emma seemed in the audio version than in the movies. So I think that, Heidi, that we're going to tie that in here because we're going to ask Ken about adaptations, like what's happening with an adaptation. Because of course there's more interpretation and filtering happening on the part of the person who's doing the adapting.
Right.
So.
Absolutely.
And of course, Clueless. We didn't mention Clueless, but Clueless is based on Emma, but set in a different time.
Yeah, it was a movie that came out, maybe 25 years ago? And it's
that sounds right.
Set in a modern high school in Beverly Hills.
So can we talk about what an adaptation does then? Because I think there is, at least I fall into this way of thinking, and then I kind of am starting to learn to catch myself and realize that there, just like a novel is a story, and then a movie is a different form of storytelling, and then an audiobook is a different form of storytelling, and a play on stage is a different form of storytelling, and all of those different modes require different things of the storyteller, but also of the reader or the person who's appreciating the story. I think that there is, for many of us, a tendency to think that a good adaptation is the one that stays the most true to the original text. So can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, because I think you and I agree that's really not the case. It's not an issue, it seems to me anyway, that whether it stays true to the original text. It's whether the final work of art that is produced, that movie, that play, that audiobook, is itself a work of art, and whether it has done something to enhance the original, not make it better, maybe enhance is the wrong word, to alter the original in a way that makes it itself a work of art and that gives us new light and new vision into the work it's based on.
So maybe talk to the original, because it kind of is like this conversation. It's almost like it needs to have something to add to the conversation. Maybe?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. Exactly right. And so
of course you do this in your work. You Baskerville is a good example of this, right?
Right.
Of a play that you've written. Is that a musical?
No, it's a straight play.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's based on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's work. And so I can't imagine, I'm curious to know what you do when you're thinking about adapting something that's a classic like that. What are you thinking through from your creator's perspective?
Well, what I did in Baskerville very consciously is I read the wonderful novel The Hound of the Baskervilles. It's a short novel, terrific, just a terrific, one of the, I think, 2 great adventure stories ever written in the English language.
Okay.
This wonderful book, and then I thought, well, if I adapt it to the stage, what can I bring to it that enhances, that makes it interesting? I can't really literally have sets that are set in London and set in Devon, on the moors of Devon, and have the hound jump out, a real hound jump out of the bushes on a stage. You can do that in a movie, but on a stage you can't do it. So what can I do? So I reduced it to 5 actors. I had 1 actor playing Holmes, 1 playing Watson, and 3 other actors who played 40 other parts. And what that did is it sort of supercharged the evening. It made it not just about the original novel, but it made it about theater. So audiences sitting are saying, how does the theater function? How can we tell the story? And it's the fun of seeing, and it adds the fun of seeing the characters changing costumes and changing accents and who they are. So it, on the one hand, so that was my way of thinking, oh, I could create a new work of art based on an older work of art. And that's what these people have done. All the ones you mentioned have really done. I think they're all works of art.
Yeah, right.
But they approach it in different ways. And I wrote down a list of things that an adapter clearly has to think about. Somebody taking Emma, those wonderful directors who did the movies and the TV adaptation, thought to themselves, what time period am I going to set it in? What's the social milieu? What style am I going to use? Is it going to be sort of an enhanced style? Will I have a narrator? The BBC one does.
Right.
How does it open? Really an interesting question. What is the setting, the costumes, and how does it deal with the exposition? And then they've also got other things they have to think about, like the budget. I was reading about Sense and Sensibility that Emma Thompson did. Remember that wonderful adaptation?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Years and years ago. And when she wrote this, she won the Oscar for writing the screenplay as well. And when she wrote the screenplay, she originally had it opening with in the English countryside during a fox and hounds chase, where the father of the clan is killed, because it's all about him dying and leaving his legacy. And the producer said, we can't afford that. Are you crazy? So she ended up doing it in a room with 2 people where he's on his deathbed.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
So often practicalities will have to do with it. And then, of course, how true am I going to stay to it? Clueless goes off to Beverly Hills, and Pride and I have 5 words for you as to how far afield you can go, which is Pride and Prejudice and zombies. There was that novel that was made into a movie that said, that's how I'm going to adapt it.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about this watching the new version, which you just watched, right?
Yep.
And I think you liked it better than I did.
I think so.
But I was thinking about the scene on Box Hill. So a little context is that they're going on an outing, and it's Emma and Frank Churchill and Mr. Elton and his new wife, Mrs. Elton, and Harriet Smith, and Jane Fairfax and
Miss Bates and Mrs. Bates.
Thank you. Yes, Miss Bates and Mrs. Bates. And Emma ends up saying something rather cruel to Miss Bates.
Mm-hmm.
And that garners a memorable chastisement from Mr. Knightley. But I was noticing how in the BBC version of the movie, I mean, Frank Churchill really goads Emma into acting badly on Box Hill. Mm-hmm. And then in the new version, I didn't see that so much.
Yeah, you mean the new movie? Absolutely. Yeah. What's interesting is in the new movie, that's quite right. I was waiting for the Box Hill moment's a big moment. It's about almost 7/8 through the novel. We see all this happening, and we see Emma growing morally. But the real big moment, that's a great one to use, is the Box Hill moment, which is that she says something that's a little cruel to Miss Bates, because Miss Bates tends to chatter on and not say very much and is a big chatterer.
Yeah.
And Emma says something cruel, and everyone stops and everyone knows. And you can see that Miss Bates, this is in the novel, Miss Bates has really taken in that Emma has made fun of her. And everybody else says, "Oh, I'm going to go walk around. It's an outing on a hill," and they all leave. And as they're a couple pages later, Mr. Knightley, her moral guide, has speeches that in the BBC version and other versions, also the Paltrow version, basically are lifted directly from the novel. What Mr. Knightley has to say, for those of you who want to find it, this is in volume 3, chapter 7 of the novel. Most editions continue to call it 3 volumes because they were published in 3 volumes.
Okay.
So you can find it. And what Mr. Knightley says is, really, Emma, this poor woman doesn't have much prospect in life, and her mother is ailing, and she's past the marriage age, and she's getting poorer and poorer, and she deserves your compassion, not amusement. And Emma feels horribly, and Knightley says, badly done, Emma.
Yes. I was looking for my copy, which I put down somewhere. So
and it makes your heart sinks, and you know how humiliated she feels.
Yes.
And the fact that she's goaded into it a bit in the book takes, a little of the onus off Emma, a little bit,
not much.
Not too much, but it's true in the BBC version, true in the other versions. But in the new version, the one that's directed by Autumn, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, de Wilde, Frank Churchill does not goad her into it at all. And so in a way, you could say it enhances the moment in this way, that it's really all on Emma. Emma makes fun of Miss Bates out of the blue and then regrets it immediately and says, well, how could I have done that? How cruel of me to do that, and spends the rest of the novel in a way trying to make up for the sin.
Yeah. Which makes me think too about what, as someone making an adaptation, then you're asking yourselves questions about because you only have I'm thinking you write plays, and when someone who's making a movie, they have a shorter amount of time to work with, so they have to pick and choose what pieces they're going to bring into the story are going to sort of shape what that movie has to say or what the play has to say. Is that right?
Absolutely. And look at a good example, again, is another example within the world we're talking about, is the way the new movie, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's Emma lives in absolute splendor. It's like a world out of the Crazy Rich Asians, if you've seen that.
Yes,
that crazy wealth. Emma lives this existence with dozens of servants around in this house that is a fairy tale house. And that really changes, in a way, how we see Emma in the wonderful BBC version, where Romola Garai, again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, I just love her. I think she's such a fantastic actress, plays Emma. We're in touch with her as you and I are in touch. We think alike. We live in the same world. In the new version, Emma is in a whole different world. She is in Crazy Rich world, and she's clearly influenced by it. You can see that kind of choice. A good example of it is in a couple of the Pride and Prejudice versions. In the Pride and Prejudice version with Colin Firth.
Yes, we like that one.
Yeah, you're like, I bet you do. Damn him. I could wear a shirt and jump in a pond too, but nobody asks me to do it.
Nobody makes gifs of it afterwards, I guess, huh?
That's right. Sadly, the house that that Elizabeth Bennet lives in with the Bennet family is a nice middle-class Georgian house, a brick house that it looks just fine to live in. In the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice, more recently, which I love. I know most Janeites who, because I see Janeites at these national conferences of Jane Austen and stuff. Most Janeites don't like it. I happen to love it because I think she's so great and so romantic and touching in it. It is, they live in a house that pigs are wandering through. So it gives you a very different view of the Bennet family in Pride and Prejudice. The two movies give you very different views of how the Bennets live and who Elizabeth Bennet is. So in the Keira Knightley version, where the pigs are walking through the house, when she goes to Mr. Darcy's house and sees Pemberley, the statues are, and the way it's filmed is gorgeous. The statues, he's very wealthy, but he's unaffected by it because he's such a good guy. But it's a whole different world for her. And clearly the filmmaker thought about that.
Yeah, and then contrasted them on purpose so that you would see that without being told, maybe.
Right.
Okay, so when you're watching a movie, so this is making me interested because I actually haven't seen the Keira Knightley version of Pride and Prejudice yet. Okay, but you just said, you enjoyed it. There are some people who don't enjoy that one as much. And then, of course, we have these Emma versions. I much prefer, should I add another much? To the BBC. I much prefer that BBC version to the new one. And I'm not sure if I can 100% pinpoint what it was about the new one that I didn't like as much, except that I didn't feel like it, what's the word I'm looking for? Like warmed me up to Emma herself. Like I didn't feel like she redeemed herself. She just seemed like a not likable character to me by the end still. So, or I'm not really sure what it was exactly. So when you're watching, like what is it? This is a weird question, but what makes you like it? Like what's the experience you're looking for when you're watching an adaptation that makes you go, I really enjoyed that?
Well, I think that's a great question because I think for me, and everybody's going to be different. For me, there's really kind of two things. It's whether the piece moves me to tears in some ways, makes me, because of the beauty of the story is told in a way. But I get moved to tears by two things. One is sort of the innate storytelling and romance and how deeply I'm involved in the characters. But I also get very moved by the quality of the work, the absolute gorgeousness of the creation of the writing and putting it in a movie. That means putting everything together. And I thought it was so well thought out and so beautiful to look at and such an unusual vision of an Austen novel that I thought that was sort of breathtaking. It's in a way that I love the new Little Women.
Oh, I love that one so much.
I love this new Little Women. And I love, many people love the old one as well. I think I did both too. At the same time. They said, oh, how am I going to ever like this as much? But the new one was fantastic because it was a swirl of colors. I thought the costumes were amazing. And they helped to tell the story in a wonderful way. And it kept shifting viewpoints. So the director of that and the screenwriter clearly had a view about how to present that story in an original way. And that's what I thought the new Emma did too. Less successfully for you, more successfully for me. Still not my favorite, but I kind of loved it. I'd like to see it again.
Well, something I really did love about it was, how every time they sat down, they all sat down at exactly the same time.
Yeah, right.
That did make me laugh every time. I thought that was really funny.
It also made me laugh how they approached Mr. Woodhouse's hypochondria.
Yes.
They don't mention it in the new version at all until the moment you see him about a quarter of the way through the film, and he's near the fire and he's got all these screens up to keep himself from feeling too hot on one side, too cold on the other side. And they do that a couple times in the film. And that was hilarious. And that's not in the novel. I mean, his hypochondria is in the novel, but
yeah. But that interpretation, it's a good thing Mr. Woodhouse doesn't have to live through coronavirus. He might be having
right.
Okay, there's a question here that this one. Amber asked, why did Jane Austen call Emma a heroine whom no one but myself will much like? What makes Emma more disagreeable than Lizzie Bennet or Marianne Dashwood, who were also overconfident in their discernment of people?
Uh, who are the two she mentions?
She mentions Elizabeth Bennet and Marianne Dashwood.
Yeah. Well, I think Elizabeth Bennet is headstrong, but is there ever a moment that we think that she's doing things in at all a mean-spirited way? I think headstrong is very different than the character of Emma, who is described, as I said, at the end of that first paragraph or first page.
Yeah.
Where she says the real evils of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much her own way and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. Well, Elizabeth Bennet has an older sister, Jane Bennet, who everyone says is the beauty of the family.
Yeah.
Everyone says is the catch of the family. Elizabeth Bennet is sort of the also-ran sister. In the movies, she's very beautiful, but in the novel, she's not meant to be the shining light that Jane is. So I think that's how they do it. And the two Dashwood sisters are very different in the same way.
Yeah, I guess, and Elizabeth Bennet strikes me maybe as a little less selfish or self-serving. I don't know. Yeah, interesting. Okay.
I don't think she's selfish at all.
Yeah,
I don't think she's selfish at all. She in fact, if she was sort of, she doesn't say, "Oh my God, this mega rich guy is coming to marry me. Of course I want to marry him." She goes with her heart. She never does anything. She loves her neighbor. She feels badly when her dear friend is going to marry Mr. Collins.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. And then there contrast that with Emma, who is sort of thoughtless when it comes to others, because she's thinking of like Harriet, and it's all Harriet marrying what's the name of the farmer she ends up marrying? Martin. Yes, right. Mr. Martin. Mm-hmm. And all Emma's, or my understanding is that Emma's mostly guided by this idea of like losing it, reflecting poorly on her, and losing her friends. So it's all about her.
Right. It's all about her. Exactly. Yeah.
Poor Emma. I do understand. Oh, let's see. This is an interesting question. I'm not sure if you know the answer, but I'm going to pitch it to you and see.
All right. Okay.
Amber Lovett asks, I'm curious about the style of writing from this time period, why authors like Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters use such details to describe sometimes the most trivial of things. I believe that is part of the beauty of their writing, but I'm wondering if there's a reason why, or if it was just a stylistic, what's the word I'm looking for?
Well, it really comes out of the period. Novels tended to be longer in those days. One of her heroes was Richardson, who wrote these long epistolary novels, and they there's a beauty to that. Those paragraphs that we read when she describes Box Hill, it's rarely that she uses that any level of prolixity over talking too much or writing too much. For no good reason. She's always got a reason behind her when she never describes anybody, I think, at too much length. We understand them so deeply. Yeah. One of the things about Jane Austen, if we're going to talk about her prose style, and it's a great question she asks, is one of the marvels of Jane Austen is that she invented a kind of new style of writing fiction, and it's called a free indirect style. What she does is she writes in the third person. She never writes in the first person. It's never, I woke up and wanted to see Harriet Smith. It's always Emma woke up and wanted to see Harriet Smith. That's third person. But she has a way of weaving into the person's mind and in and out of different people in the room's mind, so that the prose is constantly going from one perspective to another. Mm. And that's a style that she invented subconsciously, unconsciously. She just wrote that way because she was such a genius, and it revolutionized how fiction was written ever after.
It's so interesting now to think through things that we don't realize were brand new in novel writing that she did. Yeah. I was just thinking, I should know this off the top of my head, but I don't. Dickens and her time period wise.
Dickens is just a little later. Dickens is sort of mid-19th century. She dies in 1817.
Okay.
And Dickens flourishes middle of the century. I don't know his
Okay.
birth date, but he's really writing 30 years later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. His work to me feels wordier, like more descriptive, less moving the storytelling forward than Jane Austen's, which feels like it's always moving. You're learning something that you need to know to understand that character's motivations, or
I agree. I agree. I mean, we love him for his amazing novels and how he changed the world also, but in a different way. But I get tired of reading Dickens, and Tale of Two Cities moves right along. But if you read the opening chapter, the one opening chapter is you got to skip it. You got to skip it. It tries to be philosophical. It was the best of times and it was the worst of times. And then it was the this and it was the that. And if you can get through that first chapter, I congratulate you, because the rest of the book's fantastic. But again, wordy, yes, absolutely, in a way that we're not used to. Greatness, without a doubt, greatness, but it's a different kind of greatness.
Yeah. Michelle asked if you're a fan of modern retellings of Jane Austen stories, or do you prefer the originals, and do you have any favorite Jane Austen retellings?
I do love modern retellings of Jane Austen, because I just love, sort of being around and thinking about Jane Austen. I think a lot of them that have been most successful have been in movies. There's one sweet movie about a modern girl who goes back and suddenly is Elizabeth Bennet, and then there's another one. What are my favorites? I liked Death Comes to Pemberley, the mystery, although I thought it started out stronger than it ended. The P.D. James mystery based on Pride and Prejudice. I didn't think it was a success. I got bored about halfway through, but whenever I get near, a sort of a Jane Austen world, I get, oh, this is exciting, because I love to revisit it. So there's a new novel out called The Other Bennet Sister. And as soon as I heard about it, I thought, oh, I want to read that, because it's a story about Mary, the middle sister, who was the sort of dowdier one who played the piano and didn't have much of a life, and how she flourishes. And I thought, I was the first in line to buy it. I love buying modern retellings. Yeah.
I like stories about the character that we always overlooked, Yeah. Judy's question is that many of Austen's novels seem to subtly address issues of slavery. In Emma, Jane even compares the governess trade to slavery. Do you know of Jane Austen's views on the subject?
Well, clearly she was such a great heart and great mind. Surely she must have been an abolitionist. And I'll bet there's biographical material about that. She touches on that area mostly in Mansfield Park, I think the lesser of, at least of the 6 novels. It's convoluted and it's not my favorite. Nabokov loved it. The father in that family is clearly a slave trader. Interestingly, I mean, that raises a really more general issue, which is I know more about, which is that everyone always talks about the fact that Jane Austen lived right through the center of the French Revolution. Born in 1775, the French Revolution is right when she's, in her early, just, teens and 20s, and all this world. And 2 of her brothers were admirals of the fleet during the French Revolution. And she never once mentions the French Revolution or any outside political world. There is nothing in her novels beyond, as she describes it at one point in one of her letters, 2 or 3, she says, or 3 or 4, I forget, families in a small village. That's her palette. That's who she writes about. And she's very clear about that's the world that she focuses on. And we go back and look for clues. Oh, what did she think about the revolution, or the American Revolution that was going on, or King George? There's a couple of interesting sidelights about that. One is that Sir Walter Scott reviewed Emma, and he just loved it. He thought it was the bee's knees, and said, this young woman writes in a way that I can never write. I am able to deliver the big bow wow. That's how he put it. I write, in Ivanhoe and Waverley, but I can't write like that and get into the hearts and minds of people the way she does. That's her niche, and that's what she's better at than anybody that ever lived in the novel. But once in a while, her path did cross with the reality of politics and real life. The Prince Regent, this goes back to about the time that she was writing Emma. The
Okay.
Prince Regent, who later became, I guess, George IV, loved her work. This is just as her first publications, when Pride and Prejudice got out there and was published. First Sensibility was published. People liked it. Pride and Prejudice, people went crazy. And then she's starting to write more things. So the Prince Regent had copies of her books at all his residences and loved her, and got his librarian, a guy named Stanier, I think was his name, James Stanier, to go and visit her and say, I want your next novel to be dedicated to me, the Prince Regent. So if you go to the beginning of your copy of Emma, you'll see that it is dedicated to the Prince Regent. And she didn't want to dedicate, he was known as kind of a loose guy who was a womanizer, and she didn't want to dedicate it to the Prince Regent in the worst way. But she thought, I have to do this. And then
poor Jane.
I know, so she did, as you'll see. And then this librarian, this kind of dowdy guy, James Stanier, librarian, has the temerity to say to her in the correspondence, oh, by the way, for your next novel, I think you could do an awful lot and make it about a librarian to a great man like the Prince Regent. So he's trying to sell her on the idea of writing about him.
Oh my gosh. And actually, if she had written about him,
probably been pretty funny, yeah.
It probably would have been hilarious. He probably wouldn't have recognized it because he wouldn't have been like, what is this foolish character? Self-centered and haughty.
Of course.
Which, there was a question, Liana asked, in referring to Emma specifically, the female population was very highlighted. And I think that's sort of true for Jane's books, right? Mm-hmm. Do you know how well that was received in her time, that she was writing stories with female protagonists about
feminism? Well, nobody blinked, because it was really part of the tradition out of which she grew. You know, all those Gothic stories and those epistolary novels she loved so much, these were all about women. Women were at the center of these all the time. So that was really part of the tradition she was writing through.
Okay. Yeah. Karen said, I hope I didn't miss this in this discussion. I don't think you did, Karen. I didn't ask you, and I should have earlier. We want to know if you have a favorite Austen novel, not an adaptation, but an original. Which one of the originals is your favorite, if you have one?
Oh, without a doubt, it's Pride and Prejudice. It's so great. It's just a perfect book. Emma's a real close second. I mean, Emma's great. It's a great novel, but The Heart and Pride and Prejudice, I've read it so many times. I think when we were talking about Pride, I brought the version I have of it that I read all the time, and I just mark it up to beat the band, because, you know, the only way as a writer you can learn is you learn from the people who came before you and how well they wrote and what they do. And so I mark up my book. Oh, I maybe not showing it. I mark up my books like crazy, and I've read Pride and Prejudice 10 times.
I know last time you were here, you showed us your marked up books, and I'm one of these days I'm going to come visit you, and I'm going to give you a hug and then go right over to your bookshelves and start looking at you.
Please.
I almost forgot to ask this question of Sarah Gentry. She submitted this question about Emma specifically, and I think it's just trying to figure out how this works in the story. She says, when Emma says she has no plans to marry, Harriet wonders why Emma would choose to be an old maid like Miss Bates. Emma says it would be fine because she would not be poor like Miss Bates. And so what Sarah wants to know is why wouldn't Emma's father's property be passed down to a male relative? Do you know?
Well, that's a really good question. That's a terrific question. And I don't know. I think that kind of that legacy issue, which appears, of course, in Pride and Prejudice, because none of the 5 girls can get the money, and that's why Mr. Collins is going to own everything the Bennets own, is clearly not the case in Emma's situation. And I suppose it had to do with the laws of how it was left. I did know that at one point, and I'm sure there's Austen scholars on this line will know it way better than I do. That if it. maybe it's if the wife's still living, it doesn't go to that family, but if the wife has passed away, then it can go straight down the family, whether it's to a male heir or a female heir. There were rules about it,
Like
and
little
maybe you could
loopholes or
write your
something.
way around it in wills in some
Yeah.
ways. Great question. But
Yeah.
Emma also, and in that exchange that she's talking about, Emma also gives an answer to Harriet Smith when Harriet asks that. And Emma's answer is, why would I get married? And she says something like, look, I live in a house that's beautiful. I have lots of money. Everyone listens to me. You know,
Again, it's all about herself, but you know.
Why knock myself out?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, I have opened the chat. So if any of you want to say some final words to Ken and thank him for being here. Ken, I love almost nothing more than chatting Jane Austen with you. So we're going to have to have you back. And maybe, actually, I haven't read The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Ooh.
So I make the worst confessions when I'm on the line with you.
You do. You do.
About what I haven't read.
Read it. It's great. It's great. It's short too. You know, it's a short novel, and there aren't many short novels. I mean, the two great adventure stories I think in the English language are that and Treasure Island, and they're both short and easy to read.
Okay, well, I'll do it, and then maybe we can convince you to come back and talk to us about that one.
I'd love it.
Hey, and also for all of you watching, somebody sent me a link to a musical of Emma that is streaming on May 7th. So when I send you the link to the replay of this video, which we will have up in the next day or two, I'll also send you the Emma guide that we've made, and I will send you a link to that. Neither Ken or I have seen it, so we don't know anything about it, but
right.
It looks, I watched the trailer, and my teenage daughters and I watched the trailer last night, and we were like, we want to watch that.
Cool.
We'll have to watch it and see.
Good.
And I have to tell you, I saw this in the chat earlier. Oh, one of our attendees here is an RN who is recovering at home from COVID-19, and she's really enjoyed this. And we just want to thank you for all of your hard work and your service at the hospital. And so thank you so much for coming. And thank you to all of you for making time to come today. We have loved sharing this time with you.
Absolutely. We should give her a round of applause.
We should. I agree.
In New York. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's great. That's really great.
So good. There's so many people clapping in the chat.
Oh, good. As they should.
Yes.
Good.
Ken, thank you so very much. Until we meet again.
Well, thanks a million. It was really great to see you.